AER. AER? AER? AER. AER is one of those types of games that pulls you in with its gorgeous art style and outstanding soundtrack, but it fades out quickly as there really isn't a big hook to keep you invested in this type of game. AER is an exploration adventure game that tells the story of a character who doesn't talk, that is on a pilgrimage to find a story that is told through expository dialogue. The gameplay overall is in tune to a walking simulator, except replace walking with flying, but even in walking simulators or games with limited interactivity, I always found something that kept me hooked enough to finish them, mainly the events unfolding in front of you through characters, story, dialogue, or gameplay, all of which could be very interesting. That wasn't the case here. While I do appreciate the game doesn't hold your hand and lets you play around and get a feel for everything, that's not to say this method of gameplay and storytelling doesn't bring its own flaws, especially when there isn't a whole lot here to talk about. As you can probably tell by now, AER has a strong visual and audio design, which is great for getting the player's attention, but it doesn't draw that attention anywhere, which makes it feel shallow. You can fly, but there are hardly any mechanics to make it interesting. The controls are fluid and fun, but it essentially boils down to just traveling. There's no combat or interactivity involved with it. You might as well just be walking from place to place. Flying is just a little bit more exhilarating. The floating islands that you explore throughout the game seem interesting on approach, but there are hardly any interesting things on them, just a few light puzzles and Easter eggs, the only significant things being pieces of lore and a few NPCs that have little to do with the story at hand, other than expository dialogue and clues to where you can find more expository dialogue, because AER doesn't really have a story. It's about looking for a story that already happened. The story told inside the story features creators and the creation of the world, as well as mentions to specific people and events like the divide of various tribes, correlating to the vastly different sets of island biomes that you happen to explore. The story is conveyed through information passed down through generations and then told through pieces of text, environments, or characters who are actually there at key points, some of whom you meet. It's some real riveting stuff, I guess, but there are issues in the storytelling itself. You find random pieces of information on the various islands, but it's not tied together very well. There's a lot of environmental storytelling here, but rarely does it stick out as unique, save for a few cool islands. It's not like you learn about something as the player character through a scripted event that gets you motivated to read more into the lore of the world. There's just random text peppered everywhere. At best, the text will correlate to something related to the environment you are in, but that's about it. Oftentimes, one set of ruins looks like the last, and what we do know about these characters and events and the lore is what we are told directly through exposition. It's not exactly left up to a different interpretation or realize any emotional connections to the characters themselves. We're not experiencing anything, we're just being told what to think. It's kind of like someone telling you about a movie rather than watching the movie yourself. And the actual linear gameplay aspect can get confusing at times due to a lack of information to refer back to. This not only hurts the lore itself because the game doesn't give you a journal reference for names or significant events, but also it can get frustrating to find out the simple task of where to go sometimes. You are given instructions for progressing through the game, but it's incredibly easy to forget or miss information. One perfect example being I found an island right next to the starting area that had an NPC that told me to head north. There is a sanctuary up north, but there is no entrance until you realize the outer islands are actually part of a puzzle to unlock the sanctuary entrance. So you do this, then you solve a puzzle inside the sanctuary itself, then you get an item, and then an NPC appears and tells you to go southwest. I went southwest and I searched all around the islands. The only thing I could find was a symbol on the side of an island that looked like the item I got. I couldn't find any clues to point me in the right direction, and when I went back to double check that I was in the right place at all, the NPC I talked to previously was nowhere to be found. Everything is left up to the island layout for trying to figure out what you're supposed to do because it's all based on vague NPC information you sometimes can't initiate again. If someone were to take a break from this game and come back forgetting where they're supposed to go, what reference would they have to get back on track? There's no inventory menu to remind me that I've picked up an item, nor is there a dialogue review tree or journal to have a database for the lore and directions. I understand this game is relatively short, clocking in at around 4 to 5 hours, and I may be a complete idiot when it comes to these types of games, but when I don't have references to reread information and I have little motivation to begin with already, I just see that as poor game design. A journal would have streamlined the lore and the navigational aspect of this game. It helps add to creating your own adventure because you're logging something in the game world. Even though we don't have any control and we are told what to think, we would at least have a strong point of reference. Instead, we're left up to reading a bunch of randomly scattered pieces of lore throughout all the islands. Games like Dark Souls have interesting and fun gameplay to get you into the game, with environmental story piquing your interest and getting you to invest more of your time into it from there. Even in a game like The Stanley Parable, which is a heavily scripted walking simulator, you are experiencing some kind of story or event unfolding in front of you. There may not be any interesting characters with plot and depth, but it's more about the presentation and surprises. Albeit the great narration for the Stanley Parable helps a lot, and Dark Souls 3 is about gameplay and atmosphere first. Environmental storytelling takes a bit of a backseat. In AER, you fly between islands and read some stuff. Not a whole lot pops up or really surprises you. There is platforming in certain areas where you can't fly, but it really isn't intuitive or satisfying because these areas that you platform in, like the caves, don't lead to anything interesting, as I alluded to earlier. The platforming itself feels very floaty without any degree of challenge. Puzzle solving is also incredibly light on challenge or engagement. It's so far just equated to shine your light here, or match the picture on the wall, or go where the ghost is pointing. Some may argue that that's the whole point. It's not supposed to have challenge. You're supposed to relax, man. But I'd argue that that is not only subjective, but having the least bit of engagement isn't always relaxing. If anything, it can be very boring and you just want to do something else. Games like Dynasty Warriors are relaxing because everything is laid out in front of you and easy to follow, but you have access to all kinds of things to keep the game interesting, like weapons and flashy attacks that keep everything flowing really nicely, and you don't really have to put a lot of brain power into attacking, but everything just looks nice on screen and it's very engaging. I'd equate this game to No Man's Sky, except if you gutted the tedious gameplay and also the large worlds that you travel to, whether you think that's a good thing or not. Now, this is not all to say that the game is terrible. While I was trying to figure out where to go and what to do in the endless quest of finding all the bits of the story, I actually enjoyed the process of exploring. I compare it to building Legos. The building process is more interesting and fun than the end result. Flying, while not mechanically interesting, is still very fun to zip around through the islands and keep an eye out on where to go next. The controls are slick, if not a bit floaty because they lack a slowdown button during flight, making it easy to overshoot landings, but the transitions between flight and walking are butter smooth. The music, as I have said before, is terrific, and the visuals really got me interested in poking around at first. The problem is that the game isn't tailored around the exploration. The map is very vague, and there isn't a ton of interest in the environments themselves other than the visuals because they only have 3 different biomes in this game. Not to mention the game world itself is very small, with a lot of small islands that have nothing to do on them, which leads to more confusion when trying to figure out where to go. As much as I like the aesthetic, soundtrack, and the exploration, it's all very short-lived, and nothing beyond that was interesting enough for me. There was no characters I cared about, no investment into the story that was told, no interesting mechanics or surprises to keep me going. It can be relaxing to just fly between islands and listen to the music, but for 15 bucks, I expected a bit more than that. A stronger set of characters to guide the player, a journal to log progress and lore, and a more aggressive use of the art and visual style to script and tell a more compelling story at hand would have made for a much stronger gameplay experience. Even if it hurt the exploration aspect just a little bit, I'd definitely be more inclined to explore more and get invested if the game utilized these aspects. But after a few hours, I could not finish the game. Call me lazy, call me dumb, but if I have no motivation to play the game anymore, why subject myself any further? Anyway, guys, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. I'm out.